The USS Halsey sat gleaming under the San Diego sun, its gray hull cutting an imposing silhouette against the harbor. Memorial Day weekend had brought dozens of visitors to the naval base, but one man stood out, not for his uniform, but for his complete lack of one. Thomas Crane, 76, wore a faded red windbreaker and khaki pants as he slowly climbed the gangway. His weathered hands gripped the railing, each step deliberate and measured. Behind him, a young Navy cadet in crisp whites watched with narrowing eyes. "Sir, this is a restricted vessel," the cadet called out, his voice sharp with authority. "Do you have authorization?" Thomas didn't turn around. He kept climbing. "Sir, I'm talking to you." What happened next would stop every sailor on that deck dead in their tracks. The confrontation that was about to unfold would expose a truth that had been buried for 40 years, a truth that would shake the very foundation of what these young cadets thought they knew about respect, sacrifice, and the quiet heroes who walk among us. But none of them knew that yet, not even the Admiral who was about to step onto that deck. Lieutenant Junior Grade Marcus Webb had been stationed aboard the USS Halsey for 8 months. At 24, he took his duties seriously, perhaps too seriously, his fellow officers sometimes joked. But Webb saw no humor in protocol. The Navy had standards, and he intended to uphold every single one. When the elderly man in civilian clothes continued up the gangway despite his order to stop, Webb felt his jaw tighten. Visitors had been cleared for the Memorial Day open house, yes, but they were supposed to check in at the quarterdeck. This man was bypassing every proper channel. "Sir, you need to stop right now." Webb jogged toward the gangway, his hand instinctively moving to his radio. Behind him, 2 other cadets, Ensign Davis and Petty Officer Rodriguez, looked up from their duties. Thomas Crane reached the top of the gangway and stepped onto the deck. He moved slowly, as if every movement carried weight. His eyes scanned the ship with an expression Webb couldn't quite read. Was it nostalgia? Recognition? The older man's gaze lingered on the forward gun mount, then shifted to the bridge. "You don't belong here, old man," Webb's voice carried across the deck, louder than he'd intended. Several sailors turned to look. This is a United States Navy destroyer, not a tourist attraction. Thomas finally turned to face him. His eyes, a startling gray blue, held something that made Webb hesitate for just a moment. Not defiance, not anger, just calm. An unshakable, almost unsettling calm. "I know what it is, son," Thomas said quietly. "Then you know you need proper clearance." Webb gestured toward the gangway. "The visitor check-in is back at the pier. You'll need to—" "I served," Thomas interrupted, his voice still soft but somehow carrying weight. Webb felt his frustration building. Everyone claimed they'd served. His own. Grandfather told Navy stories at every family gathering, most of them probably exaggerated. These old-timers showed up at every open house, trying to relive their glory days, getting in the way of actual sailors doing actual work. "Sir, I'm sure you did, and we appreciate your service." Webb's tone suggested otherwise. "But regulations are regulations. You can't just board a Navy vessel without—" "Is there a problem here?" Ensign Davis had approached, her expression curious but professional. At 22, she was even newer to the fleet than Webb, but she had a way of diffusing situations that Webb lacked. "This gentleman needs to go back to visitor processing," Webb explained, his voice tight. Thomas looked at Davis, then back at Webb. "I was told Captain Morrison authorized—" "Captain Morrison isn't aboard," Webb cut him off. "And even if he were, protocol requires all visitors to check in at the designated station. No exceptions." Rodriguez, a burly second-class petty officer with 10 years of service, stepped closer. He studied the old man with a different kind of attention than Webb's impatient scrutiny. Something in the veteran's bearing, the way he held himself despite his age, triggered a recognition Rodriguez couldn't quite name. "What's your name, sir?" Rodriguez asked. "Thomas Crane." The name meant nothing to Webb. "Mr. Crane, I'm going to have to ask you to leave the ship. If you refuse, I'll be forced to call security." He reached for his radio again. "Marcus, maybe we should—" Davis started. "No, Sarah. Rules exist for a reason." Webb keyed his radio. "Quarterdeck, this is Lieutenant Webb. I need security to the forward deck. We have an unauthorized—" "Unauthorized?" Thomas's voice remained steady, but something flickered in those gray-blue eyes. Not anger. Disappointment, perhaps. "Son, I've walked the decks of more ships than you've probably seen in photographs." "I'm sure you have, sir." Webb's patience had evaporated entirely. In whatever capacity you served, supply, administration, wherever. I'm certain you did your job. But this is a guided missile destroyer, and you are currently trespassing on a United States military vessel. The words hung in the air like a slap. Rodriguez winced. Davis looked away. Even Webb, self-righteous as he felt, sensed he might have crossed a line. But he didn't back down. Protocol was protocol. Thomas Crane stood perfectly still. For a long moment, he simply looked at the young lieutenant. Then, without another word, he turned toward the gangway. "That's better," Webb muttered. But as Thomas took his first step back toward the pier, a voice rang out from the quarterdeck, a voice that carried decades of command authority and made every sailor on that deck snap to attention. "Belay that order." Admiral James Hawthorne, 3 stars gleaming on his collar, strode across the deck. His eyes weren't on Webb or Davis or Rodriguez. They were locked on the old man in the red windbreaker. An admiral's. Hawthorne's face had gone absolutely white. The deck fell silent. Even the harbor sounds, seagulls crying, water lapping against the hull, distant conversations from neighboring ships, seemed to fade into background noise as Admiral Hawthorne approached. Webb snapped to attention, his earlier confidence wavering. "Sir, I was just—" Hawthorne held up one hand, silencing him without a word. The Admiral's eyes never left Thomas Crane. "Tommy?" Hawthorne's voice cracked slightly on the name. "Tommy Crane?" Thomas turned slowly back around. A small sad smile crossed his weathered face. "Hello, Jim." What happened next would be discussed in the enlisted mess for months. Admiral James Hawthorne, a man who'd commanded carrier strike groups and led operations in 3 different war zones, crossed the remaining distance in 4 quick strides and embraced the elderly civilian like a brother. "My God," Hawthorne breathed. "My God, Tommy. We all thought, I know." Thomas patted the Admiral's back gently. "I know what everyone thought." Webb stood frozen, his mind racing. Davis and Rodriguez exchanged confused glances. Around them, more sailors had gathered, drawn by the commotion. A 3-star admiral didn't embrace random visitors. Something significant was happening, and nobody understood what. Hawthorne pulled back, his hands still gripping Thomas's shoulders, as if afraid the old man might disappear if he let go. "How long has it been? 30 years? 40? 42, Thomas said quietly. "Give or take." The Admiral's eyes shone with emotion Webb had never seen from a flag officer. "We looked for you, Tommy. After Operation Copper Shield, after the extraction went bad, we looked for months. The Navy declared you—" He stopped, swallowing hard. "They declared you killed in action." The words fell on the assembled sailors like a depth charge. Webb felt his stomach drop. KIA. Killed in action. This wasn't some retired supply clerk or pencil pusher. This man had been declared dead in combat. "I was extracted eventually," Thomas said, his voice carrying to the listening crowd despite its softness. "But by then, the mission was classified so far above top secret that it was easier for everyone if I just stayed gone." Hawthorne shook his head slowly. "I tried to find out what happened. For years I tried. They stonewalled me at every turn. Even when I made captain, then admiral, certain files remained sealed." He paused. "Operation Copper Shield. Vietnam, 1973. The last days before the fall of Saigon." Thomas nodded once. "You were deep cover," Hawthorne continued, speaking to Thomas, but clearly aware of the audience. "Navy intelligence. We were just junior officers then, but I knew your real mission wasn't what they told the rest of the team." He turned to look at Webb and the other sailors. "Thomas Crane was the finest intelligence officer I ever served with. He infiltrated North Vietnamese command structures for 18 months. 18 months behind enemy lines, gentlemen. No extraction plan, no backup, just his training and his nerve." Rodriguez straightened unconsciously. Davis had stopped breathing. Webb felt heat creeping up his neck. "You don't belong here, old man." His own words echoed mockingly in his memory. "Sir, I didn't—" Webb started. "You didn't know," Thomas interrupted gently, saving him from Admiral Hawthorne's attention. "You couldn't have known. It's all right, son." But it wasn't all right. Webb had done everything by the book, and somehow that made it worse. He'd followed every protocol, upheld every regulation, and in doing so had treated a genuine war hero like a trespasser. "Why didn't you check in at the quarterdeck?" Webb asked, his voice small. "Why didn't you tell me who you were?" Thomas's sad smile returned. "Because I wanted to see if I could still do it, if I could still walk onto a ship like I belonged there. Stupid old man pride, I suppose. He glanced at Hawthorne. And I didn't know you'd be here, Jim. I was told Captain Morrison might give me a tour, for old time's sake. Morrison's my former XO, Hawthorne explained. I'm here for the Memorial Day ceremony. When Morrison told me he'd authorized a special visitor named Thomas Crane, the Admiral's voice trailed off. I had to see for myself if it could possibly be the same man. It's me, Thomas said simply. Hawthorne turned to address the growing crowd of sailors. This man saved 17 American lives in 1973. 17 confirmed, probably more. He fed intelligence that changed the course of naval operations in the Pacific. And when his cover was blown, he didn't run. He stayed to complete his mission, knowing extraction was impossible. The mission was more important than one man, Thomas said quietly, but several sailors close enough to hear caught the words. They captured you, Hawthorne said. It wasn't a question. Thomas nodded. For 8 months. The deck had gone absolutely silent. Even the seagulls seemed to have stopped crying. 8 months. Vietnamese prison camps were legendary for their brutality. And this man, this quiet, unassuming man in a red windbreaker, had survived one. But what Admiral Hawthorne said next would change everything these young sailors thought they knew about the man standing before them. Show them your arms, Tommy, Admiral Hawthorne said softly. Thomas hesitated. For the first time since stepping aboard, Webb saw genuine discomfort cross the old man's face. Not fear, not pain, something closer to reluctance. Jim, that's not necessary. They need to understand, Hawthorne interrupted gently. These young sailors need to know what real sacrifice looks like, what it costs. After a long moment, Thomas slowly unzipped his red windbreaker and shrugged it off. Underneath, he wore a simple white t-shirt. His arms, revealed to the sunlight, told a story no words could fully capture. Scars. Dozens of them. Some thin and surgical, others thick and brutal. They crisscrossed his forearms like a roadmap of suffering. Around his wrists, faint but unmistakable, were the permanent marks left by years, not months, years of restraints. Davis gasped. Rodriguez muttered something under his breath that might have been a prayer. Webb couldn't move, couldn't speak, couldn't do anything but stare at the evidence of torture written on an old man's skin. 8 months in captivity, Hawthorne's voice carried across the silent deck. But Thomas Crane didn't break. Not once. Not when they... The Admiral stopped, his voice thick with emotion. Not when they did things I won't describe to him. He never revealed his mission, never compromised his fellow sailors, never gave them a single actionable piece of intelligence. I gave them just enough, Thomas said quietly, pulling his windbreaker back on. Just enough false information mixed with things they already knew, kept them convinced I was valuable enough to keep alive. You survived through sheer willpower and tradecraft, Hawthorne corrected. And when a special operations team finally extracted you in 74, you'd lost 60 pounds and could barely walk. Thomas's jaw tightened. Plenty of men had it worse. Plenty of men broke, Hawthorne countered. You didn't. Webb felt like he might be sick. You don't belong here, old man. The words wouldn't stop echoing. He'd said that to a man who'd endured 8 months of torture for his country. He'd ordered security to remove a genuine war hero from a Navy vessel. Sir, Webb's voice cracked. Sir, I apologize. I didn't know. I should have. You did your job, Lieutenant. Thomas turned to face him directly. You followed protocol. You protected your ship. That's exactly what you should have done. But I treated you like someone who hadn't properly checked in, Thomas finished. Which, technically, I hadn't. A hint of warmth entered his eyes. You were doing what you were trained to do. Never apologize for that. Rodriguez stepped forward. Sir, with respect, the lieutenant's point stands. We should have recognized. Recognized what? Thomas asked. An old man in civilian clothes? Why would you? The Navy trained you to verify, not assume. That's good training. But Davis shook her head. There's a difference between following protocol and... She struggled for words. And the way we spoke to you. Thomas sighed. I'm going to tell you something, and I want you to listen carefully. He looked around at the assembled sailors, making eye contact with as many as he could. The worst part of what happened to me wasn't the prison camp. It wasn't the torture. It wasn't even the months of isolation. He paused, letting the words sink in. The worst part was coming home and realizing that nobody could know what really happened. The mission stayed classified. The men I saved never knew who'd saved them. My family was told I died in a training accident. I attended my own memorial service. Disguised, watching my mother cry over an empty casket. His voice remained steady, but the pain underneath was unmistakable. I was erased from the records, given a new identity, told to start over and never speak of my service. Hawthorne nodded. Black Ops, the kind of operations that never make the history books. I made peace with it, Thomas continued. I did what needed to be done, and I was proud to do it. But understand this, I don't expect recognition. I don't expect respect just because I'm old and I say I served. What I expect, what every veteran expects, is that you'll do your duty with integrity, like Lieutenant Webb did today. Webb didn't feel like he'd acted with integrity. He felt like he'd been small-minded and dismissive, but he kept silent, sensing Thomas had more to say. You're young, Thomas addressed Webb directly. You see an old man and you see someone who doesn't belong in your world anymore, someone slow, out of touch, unable to keep up. He smiled sadly. And you know what? You're not wrong. I am old. I am slow. I can't do the things I did 40 years ago. But that doesn't mean, Davis started. Let me finish. Thomas held up one scarred hand. What I want you to understand is that someday, if you're lucky, if you survive your service, you'll be old too. You'll walk slowly. You'll forget things. You'll watch young sailors look at you the way Lieutenant Webb looked at me today. Webb flinched. And when that day comes, Thomas continued, I hope you'll remember this moment. I hope you'll remember that every old veteran was once young and capable. That every slow step and weathered face represents missions completed, risks taken, sacrifices made. You don't have to respect the old man, but respect what that old man once was. The words hung in the salt air like an anchor dropping into deep water. Admiral Hawthorne stepped forward. Thomas Crane received the Navy Cross for his actions during Operation Copper Shield. It was presented in a closed ceremony with only 3 people present. The citation remains classified, but I was one of those 3 people, and I can tell you that what this man did... He stopped, collecting himself. What this man did kept a crucial intelligence network intact for another 6 months. That network saved American lives. It prevented ambushes. It brought sailors home. He turned to Webb. Lieutenant, you asked why Mr. Crane didn't announce himself, didn't demand special treatment. That's because men like Thomas Crane don't demand anything. They do their job, they bear the cost, and they move on. The question isn't why he didn't tell you who he was. The question is, why did you assume he was nobody? The words hit Webb like a physical blow. Admiral Hawthorne wasn't finished. He gestured toward the bridge. Everyone, return to your duties except Lieutenant Webb, Ensign Davis, and Petty Officer Rodriguez. Mr. Crane, if you're willing, I'd like you to join us in the wardroom. The crowd of sailors dispersed reluctantly, many of them casting backward glances at Thomas Crane. Webb could hear the whispered conversation starting already, the story spreading through the ship like wildfire. By nightfall, every sailor aboard would know what had happened. The small group made their way below deck to the officers' wardroom. It was a modest space. The Halsey was a destroyer, not a carrier, but comfortable enough. Hawthorne gestured for everyone to sit. Tommy, I have to ask, the Admiral said once they were settled. Why now? Why come back after all these years? When Morrison called and said someone named Thomas Crane wanted a tour, I couldn't believe it. You've been ghost for 40 years. Thomas leaned back in his chair, suddenly looking every one of his 76 years. I'm dying, Jim. The words fell like stones into still water. Pancreatic cancer, stage 4. Doctors give me maybe 6 months, probably less. He said it matter-of-factly, as if discussing the weather. I wanted to stand on the deck of a Navy ship one more time before I go. Wanted to smell the salt air, hear the sounds, remember what it felt like to be part of something bigger than myself. Hawthorne's face had gone pale again. Tommy, I'm so sorry. Is there anything... No, Thomas interrupted gently. There's nothing anyone can do, and I'm at peace with it, really. He smiled. I got 43 bonus years after that prison camp. I got to watch the Berlin Wall fall, see the Soviet Union collapse, witness the whole world change. I got to live, Jim. That's more than a lot of our brothers got. Rodriguez cleared his throat. Sir, can I ask, after everything you went through, after being erased like that, do you regret it? Your service, I mean. Thomas considered the question seriously. Not once, not for a single second. He looked at each of them in turn. I knew what I was signing up for. Maybe not the specifics, but I knew the cost might be high. And I paid it gladly because I still believe, that some things are worth sacrificing for. What things? Davis asked quietly. Freedom? Democracy? The idea that people should be able to live without fear of tyranny. Thomas's voice strengthened. The men and women who serve alongside you, when you're in that camp, when they're hurting you, trying to break you, you don't think about grand ideals. You think about faces, the sailors on your team, the pilots who flew missions based on your intelligence, the families who got their sons and daughters back because you didn't give up information that would have gotten them killed. Webb had been silent since they'd entered the wardroom, but now he found his voice. Sir, I need to apologize again, not just for following protocol, but for the way I followed it, the tone I used, the assumptions I made. Marcus, can I call you Marcus? Thomas asked. When Webb nodded, he continued. Marcus, you were trained to be suspicious, to verify, to protect your ship from threats. In today's world, that's critical. You didn't know me. You saw an old man bypassing security protocols. You responded appropriately. But the way I spoke to you was disrespectful, Thomas acknowledged. Yes, but here's something I learned in that camp, something that kept me sane. You can't control what others do to you. You can only control how you respond. He leaned forward. You made a mistake in tone. You've acknowledged it. You've apologized. Now you move forward and do better. That's what growth looks like. Hawthorne nodded. Tommy's right. But Marcus, let this be a lesson. Every person you meet has a story. Some of those stories involve sacrifices you can't imagine. The homeless veteran on the street corner might be dealing with PTSD from combat you'll never see. The old man fumbling with his credit card at the commissary might have hands that shake from torture-induced nerve damage. You can follow protocol and still treat people with dignity, Davis added quietly. They're not mutually exclusive. Exactly, Thomas agreed. I don't expect special treatment because of what I did. But basic human dignity, respect for any person, regardless of rank or status, that's not special treatment. That's just being decent. Rodriguez spoke up. Sir, you mentioned watching your family believe you were dead. Do they know you're alive now? Thomas's face fell slightly. My mother passed away in 1982. My father 3 years later, both still believing I'd died in 1973. He paused. That's the real cost of Black Ops work that nobody talks about. You don't just sacrifice yourself. You sacrifice the people who love you. The room fell silent. I had a sister, Thomas continued. Younger than me by 5 years. Last month, I finally got permission from the Navy to reach out to her. After 42 years, I called her and said, Claire, it's Tommy. His voice cracked slightly. She hung up on me, thought it was a cruel joke. It took 3 more calls and a visit from a Navy chaplain to convince her I was real. How did she react? Davis asked. Thomas smiled sadly. She slapped me, hard. Then she hugged me. Then she slapped me again. Then we both cried for about an hour. He laughed quietly. She said I had a lot of explaining to do and that 42 years wasn't nearly enough time to make up for what I'd put her through. She was right. But she forgave you? Rodriguez asked. She understood. There's a difference. Thomas looked at his scarred hands. She understood why I did what I did. She even respected it. But forgiveness, that's harder. How do you forgive someone for letting you grieve their death for 4 decades? Admiral Hawthorne stood abruptly and moved to the small cabinet in the corner of the wardroom. He pulled out a bottle of whiskey and 5 glasses. This seems like a moment that requires proper toast. He poured small amounts into each glass and distributed them. Then he raised his glass toward Thomas. To Thomas Crane. To the missions we can't discuss, the sacrifices we can't repay, and the heroes who walk among us unrecognized. He paused. And to second chances, however brief. They drank. Thomas set his glass down and looked at Webb. Marcus, I want you to understand something. What happened on deck today, that wasn't a mistake. It was a teaching moment, not just for you, but for me too. How so? Webb asked. I tested you, not intentionally, but I tested you nonetheless, and you responded with certainty and authority. That's good. The Navy needs officers who will enforce standards even when it's uncomfortable. He smiled. But the Navy also needs officers who can balance certainty with humility, Who can be strong without being hard? Who can uphold standards while maintaining compassion? How do you balance those things? Webb asked. You don't, Thomas admitted. Not perfectly. You'll make mistakes. You'll be too hard sometimes, too soft others, but you stay conscious of the balance. You keep trying. He glanced at Davis and Rodriguez. All of you, stay conscious of it. Hawthorne checked his watch. Tommy, the Memorial Day ceremony starts in 2 hours. I'd be honored if you'd join us on the platform. Maybe say a few words. Thomas shook his head firmly. No, I came for a tour, not recognition. Besides, he smiled. I'm still technically dead, remember? Probably best if we keep it that way. The classification was lifted last year, Hawthorne revealed. Operation Copper Shield was declassified. Your name, your service, your medals, it's all in the public record now. You could reclaim your identity if you wanted. What would be the point? Thomas asked. I'm an old man dying of cancer. Let the young sailors have their ceremony. I'll watch from the crowd like everyone else. That's enough for me. But it wasn't enough for Marcus Webb. The Memorial Day ceremony on the USS Halsey concluded with full military honors. Families filled the pier, children waved flags, and young sailors stood proud in their dress whites. Admiral Hawthorne delivered a moving speech about sacrifice and service, and in the back of the crowd, wearing his faded red windbreaker, Thomas Crane watched silently. What nobody saw was what happened after the ceremony, after the crowds dispersed and the families went home. Marcus Webb, Sarah Davis, and Miguel Rodriguez found Thomas standing alone at the end of the pier, looking out at the harbor. Sir, Webb said quietly, we wanted to thank you. Thomas turned, surprised. Thank me? For what? For the lesson, Davis said. For not making us feel worse than we already did. For showing us what real strength looks like, Rodriguez added. Webb stepped forward. In his hands he held something wrapped in cloth. He carefully unfolded it, revealing his own service ribbons, the ones he'd earned in his short career, the ones he wore proudly on his dress uniform. This probably doesn't mean much, Webb said. But I wanted you to have this. He held out a single ribbon, the Navy and Marine Corps Achievement Medal. It was given to me for meritorious service during a humanitarian mission. At the time, I thought it was a big deal. Now, he smiled sadly. Now I know it's not even close to what you earned. But it represents something I learned today. That service isn't about the medals. It's about showing up, doing the job, and treating people with dignity whether they've earned your respect or not. Thomas looked at the ribbon for a long moment. Then gently he pushed Webb's hand back. Keep it, son. You earned it, and one day you'll have stories to tell about where it came from. He smiled. Besides, I have enough ribbons gathering dust in a drawer somewhere. There is something you can do for me, though, Thomas added. Anything, all three said simultaneously. Tell the story. When you're training new sailors, when you're mentoring junior officers, when you're an old admiral like Jim someday, tell them about today. Tell them about the old man in the red windbreaker. Tell them that respect isn't about rank or recognition. It's about recognizing the humanity in everyone you meet. We will, Webb promised. Thomas nodded. Then my trip here was worth it. He turned back to the harbor, to the ships cutting silhouettes against the setting sun. You know what I see when I look at those ships? What, sir? Davis asked. Hope, continuity. Every generation thinking they're the first to face hard choices, and every generation finding the courage to make them anyway. He glanced at the three young sailors. You're good people. You'll make mistakes. You'll second-guess yourselves. But you'll also do great things. Just remember, the measure of a sailor isn't how many medals they earn. It's how they treat people when nobody's keeping score. They stood together in silence, watching the sun sink lower. Admiral Hawthorne found them there 20 minutes later. He pulled Thomas aside for a private conversation that the three younger sailors couldn't hear. But they saw Hawthorne hand Thomas something. Papers, perhaps, or photographs. They saw Thomas's shoulders shake slightly, saw the Admiral embrace him one more time. When Thomas finally left the pier, walking slowly toward the parking lot, he stopped once and turned back. He raised one scarred hand in a simple wave. Webb, Davis, and Rodriguez snapped to attention and saluted. Thomas Crane returned the salute, a gesture he'd last performed in uniform 42 years ago, and disappeared into the crowd. 6 months later, on a cold November morning, Admiral James Hawthorne attended a small funeral in Arlington National Cemetery. Only a handful of people were present: a sister, 2 nephews, and 3 young Navy sailors who'd traveled across the country on their own time. The headstone was simple: Thomas James Crane, Lieutenant U.S. Navy, 1948-2025. He served in silence. At the funeral, Webb told the story of the old man in the red. Windbreaker. He told it honestly, including his own mistakes, his own quick judgments. Claire Crane, Thomas's sister, hugged him afterward and whispered, "He would have liked that you didn't make him into a saint. He always hated being put on a pedestal." As they walked away from the gravesite, Rodriguez turned to Webb. "Think we'll ever fully understand what he went through? What guys like him sacrificed?" Webb shook his head. "No, but we can honor it, we can remember it, and we can treat every veteran, every person, like they might be carrying an invisible weight we'll never see." "Because they probably are," Davis finished quietly. They walked in silence back to their car, but each of them carried something from that Memorial Day encounter that would shape their entire careers. Marcus Webb would eventually command his own ship, known for running a tight operation while never forgetting the human cost of military service. Sarah Davis would become an advocate for veteran mental health services. Miguel Rodriguez would spend his post-Navy years volunteering at VA hospitals, listening to stories from aging veterans who just needed someone to acknowledge their sacrifice. And sometimes, late at night, they would each think about an old man in a red windbreaker standing on a Navy destroyer deck, teaching them the lesson their training had missed: that true strength doesn't announce itself, true sacrifice often goes unrecognized, and true heroism is measured not by the medals you wear but by the dignity with which you treat others when the world has forgotten your name. Because at the end of the day, real valor never demands recognition, it simply serves.